Good afternoon. I'm Husain Haqqani from the Hudson Institute. I am part of the South and Central Asia program here at Hudson. We are very pleased today to have a full house and an excellent panel to discuss the India-United States relationship. It was about 2004 when the first time the term strategic partnership was used in relation to the India-US relationship. Even earlier, way back in 1948, the Truman administration spoke about a natural partnership with India. And yet, the history of the last 6 decades has not shown the realization of that full potential. The natural partnership has not necessarily progressed as a natural partnership. There have been issues on both sides. Now, of course, we have a new Prime Minister in India that has raised hopes for a revived relationship, a better and more robust relationship. And it has several dimensions, the economic not being less important than the political and the military. And we have a stellar panel here today to discuss that. I will introduce everyone just by name. You all know their bios. And we will have a discussion in which they will all give their thoughts on specific questions that have been or specific themes that have been framed for them. So to my immediate left is Sadanand Dhume, who is at the American Enterprise Institute, writes for the Wall Street Journal, and has worked as a foreign correspondent for the Far Eastern Economic Review in India and Indonesia, and was a Bernard Schwartz Fellow at the Asia Society. To his left, not necessarily politically, is Bruce Riedel, a dear friend and a scholar, and a very well-known analyst who has 30 years of service from the, with the Central Intelligence Agency. He is Senior Fellow and Director of the Brookings Intelligence Project, which is part of Brookings' new Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence. He has advised presidents. He has been involved with understanding the region that we are talking about and has in-depth understanding of that region. Next to Bruce is Alyssa Ayres. She's a Senior Fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. She served most recently as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia at the State Department during 2010-2013. Prior to serving in the Obama administration, she led the India and South Asia practice at McLarty Associates, the Washington-based international strategic advisory firm. She was trained originally as a cultural historian, and she has experience in the non-profit, government, and private sectors, and has carried out research on both India and Pakistan. And she's also the author of one of the best books on Pakistan in the context of how the Pakistani nation was forged. So she will be talking to us about India today. And then we have Tanvi Madan, who is a fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and director of the India project there. Her work explores Indian foreign policy, focusing in particular on India's relations with China and the United States. She also researches the intersection between Indian energy policies and its foreign and security policies. At the far end of this table is Ambassador Pradeep Kapur. He's a visiting clinical professor in the School of Public Policy at University of Maryland. He began his career as a diplomat in 1981 in Spain and went on to have postings as a career diplomat from India in Tanzania, Paris, and Nepal. In 1991, Ambassador Kapur was selected as UN Fellow with a Third World Diplomat Award, under which he taught at Georgetown University. He was also India's ambassador to Cambodia and served as India's ambassador to Chile from 2009 to 2013. So let's get our discussion underway. Among the things we will try to address is, will India and America be able to forge the strategic partnership that they have spoken of, but that they have not been able to create under Prime Minister Modi? And the visit that he's having here I know that there are some elements of the media that are more focused on stuff like whether he will be fasting while he's here or partaking of American food. But I think we are more interested in the more substantive questions of what does it mean? Will this one visit actually be the catalyst for major transformation of the relationship? And I would request Ambassador Kapur to go first. I would like him to start the discussion rolling with a discussion on the overall conceptualization of India's foreign policy. How does India and the Indian foreign policy establishment view ties with the United States? Have views changed sufficiently from the opinions that were forged in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s when India was non-aligned and America was looking for allies against communism? So how far have things changed, and how do Indians now view the US-India relationship? Ambassador Kapur.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Haqqani. It's a great pleasure for me to see all of you here and to recognize quite a few friends in this group. I would like to welcome the media also. There has been a lot of interest. There has been a lot of media interest, business interest, interest from various other sectors all over Washington, all over USA on this visit. As Ambassador Haqqani has set me a very difficult task of analyzing these relations in a historical perspective and seeing where we come from and where do we go. I'll try to do it in a way that gives us a platform to proceed on our discussion. India has been always viewing the USA in a very idealistic sort of manner for a long time. Before our independence in 1947, USA was one of the important countries in the Committee of Nations which kept on nudging the United Kingdom, the colonial power, to give India its freedom. They gave a platform to our independence fighters like Mahatma Gandhi. They gave access to the media to propagate their views on Indian independence. Now, these were very important factors which ultimately led to our getting independence from the British in 1947 in August. And since that time onwards, Indians at the level of the civil society has had a very favorable and positive view of the United States. Soon after our independence, again, and even before the independence, in 1945, the US opened its embassy in Delhi and allowed India to open up a mission here in Washington, D.C., even as a non-independent country. So that was another very significant gesture, which is not forgotten by the Indians. Thereafter, by 1947, the Indian contribution to the global economy, to the global growth, GDP, had fallen from a very high percentage of about 28, 150 years back, to less than 2% after this colonial era. And we were not even dependent in terms of growing our own food grains. Again, the US played a very significant role. The PL 480 shipments of food grains would come in. And the joke in those days in Delhi was that India is living from the ships to the lips. Because if there was a delay of a ship for a few days, it would make the situation quite critical. And then, again, in the matter of green revolution, the US contribution was very significant. So, in all these factors, the nuclear establishment in India was set up primarily with the aid we got from Canada and the USA. And if I start listing out the sectors in which a country at its nascent stage, when it is looking for a lot of handholding, got the assistance that was very critical for its growth, for its stability, for its future, it's very vast. So, and that has only expanded over time. Now, I'll jump to today's date, because if I go over it step by step, I'll be exceeding a lot of my time and other people's time. What do we have today? We have two of the most important countries in the world in so many different ways for the future of the world. India is the largest democracy. India brings a lot to the table. India is a civilizational power. India has the strength of its civilization of 5,000 years or 10,000 years behind it. India has contributed globally to the growth of the world in different sectors, in so many different areas. India is today at a point where it's going to become a very important driver of the global economy. We have had elections recently, defying all predictions and all the bettings all over the world, and all the bets placed in America, in India, in the Arab world, that no party will come back with a majority. And even the alliance which will come back with a majority, either of the two alliances, will just scrape through with the majority. And the results which came out were absolutely different. No single bet was placed anywhere in the world for just to put the record right, that Modi and his party, the BJP, will get an absolute majority by itself. They got an absolute majority, an overwhelming majority. Their alliance got 333 out of 545 seats, which was unprecedented, which was absolutely unpredicted. So what do we get today is a leader who has a very good track record, a very proven track record. As the Chief Minister of Gujarat, he served for 14 years. He's taken the state forward in every sector. He's a very pragmatic leader. He's a very strong leader. He's a very clear-headed leader. He's got his vision of India, and he's got the parliamentary support. So he can take decisions today which earlier were not possible, because if you're part of an alliance, part of a coalition, you always need the support of the coalition parties, the coalition partners. You cannot make any announcements for any policy decisions or any reforms or any changes in your interest to move ahead on different sectors, FDI, investments, outward flows, on business rules and regulations. But if you have this sort of majority, there are various areas in which you can take decisions and move ahead much faster. So half of the aspects of growth of a nation are dictated by sentiments, by the hopes, by the aspirations, by the expectations, by the feelings. So you have a country of 1.25 billion which has elected a leader with such a massive majority, and now he's poised to take India out of its stupor of the last 5 years particularly, and again lead from the front. On the American side, on the US side, you have again a leader like Obama, who's again got a lot of these attributes, a very pragmatic leader, a very strong leader, a very clear-headed leader, and he has got more than 2 years of his tenure still left. So I think both these countries are poised for an orbital jump in their relations. When I say orbital jump, it is not a far-fetched expectation, because orbital jump is you go from one orbit to the other. You're not going from the Earth to an orbit. So there have been expectations in the past which have not been fulfilled because both the countries have a lot of excessive expectations of each other. We are both very democratic. We have a very strong systems of governance. The parliament in India is very strong. The media in India is very strong. The civil society in India is very strong. Similarly, on the US side, the institutions are very strong. The Congress, the Senate, the judiciary. I have been here all of 3 weeks and 3 days, so I still have to learn my way around again. I was last year about 24 years back. And for 35 years, I was serving the Indian diplomacy from the years 1979 onwards in various capacities in all the continents of the world. And I retired as secretary to the government of India very recently. So now I'm working in the University of Maryland as a professor in the School of Public Policy. And the areas where we have very intense discussions going on with the American side span more than anything anybody in this room can ever imagine. And when I start reading about it, I myself, a practitioner of diplomacy, who was Deputy Secretary of Americas in the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi at one stage during my stint in India, when I see where it is today, it comes as a very pleasant surprise and shock to me to see how far we have gone ahead, how far we have expanded, how far we have intensified our relations in every sector, in every sphere. There is hardly any sector I can imagine where we are not engaged in a very intensive manner with projects, with dialogues, with interactions, with exchanges, with visits with the US. So if we were to just go by what we are doing actually on the ground, any analyst would feel, oh my goodness, what a beautiful relationship.
Thank you, Ambassador Kapur. I think we're coming to the close of the time window. But
so let me just finish by mentioning the areas only, so that will lead to the discussion further. We have collaboration in cyber security, in homeland security, in defense. India is the largest buyer of American weapons in the world. Education, public health, human capital growth, energy, environment, infrastructure, urban development, civilian space cooperation, nuclear cooperation, humanitarian and disaster relief operations, responses and operations, gas, Mars mission, space exploration, and as I mentioned, biotechnology. And the other aspect which also is contributing very significantly is the Indian diaspora here. And I will now stop here so that we can then take it on again at the stage of questions and answers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. With 10-minute presentations, and then we will open it up for discussion. That's going to create a much better environment for a discussion. Alyssa, I would go next to you. Basically, I think we need to hear an argument from the American side as to why relations with India are important. You worked on this relationship. You would know that. But just a summary of what the American administration can or should do to build closer ties, especially in the economic area, because that's where there's potential is huge. Everybody talks about it, but it's an unrealized potential. And most of us would agree that the potential is unrealized. There's an American perspective to it. There's an Indian perspective to it. How can America walk sort of the few steps forward that would then enable India to walk its part and for them to meet somewhere in the middle? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Husain. I've just put my stopwatch on here, so I'll be tracking the time, and don't hesitate to let me know if I go over a little
Sure.
bit. I'm very happy to be here today. We've got a great audience. Thanks to Ambassador Kapur for setting things up so nicely. I would also like to note that this is the first time I've ever appeared on a panel with Mr. Dhume, who's my husband. So this is a first. Let's see if there's any disagreement later on in the conversation.
My only request would be not to carry the disagreement too far when you get back home.
Exactly.
We like you two together.
So I was asked to speak about the U.S. perspective on why relations with India are important to the United States. I thought that Ambassador Kapur laid out a very good rationale for why relations with the United States are important for India, so I don't have to make that argument this morning. Why relations with India are important for the United States? we now have, I think, a consensus in Washington on that count, that India's rise is in the strategic interests of the United States, and that the U.S. is making a long-term bet on India's rise. In fact, there really is no significant disagreement. Do I need to pull it closer? Okay. There really is no significant disagreement on a partisan basis throughout Washington on this question. You see, 3 consecutive administrations working very hard to further the relationship with India. This is really built on the premise that the rise of a democratic, stable, pluralistic, market-oriented economy, India, is inherently in the national interests of the United States, will help assure the balance of power in Asia, that we in India share common goals in the fight against terrorism. I would commend to all of you the superb new essay that Ashley Tellis has just released from the Carnegie Endowment. He goes into the strategic argument at length. So I was asked to speak more specifically in our panel today about economic relations between the United States and India, and what the U.S. could do to build closer ties with India. If I had been asked to speak about what India could do to build closer economic ties with the United States, my list would look a little bit different. So maybe we can go into some of that in Q&A. But there are some things that I think the U.S. can do. Certainly, India's new Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, seeks to get Indian economic growth back on track. That was a key element of the BJP's campaign this year. There are early signs of a growth uptick. We have not yet begun to see what many would describe as the Big Bang reform. People are still waiting for that. It's only been a little bit more than 100 days, still early days. But I do want to acknowledge very frankly up front that the past couple years, and particularly the last year, in U.S.-India relations has been dominated with stories of disappointment, particularly on the trade and economic front. So it's an area with great potential, but one in which there have been substantial frictions over the course of the last couple years. I can't pretend in this context that the U.S. companies, business associations, Capitol Hill, haven't been angry about some of the developments in India. So we need to get back on track, but there have been some hurdles to overcome. The previous government of India was very focused on implementing large welfare schemes. Growth began to slow, and even worse, some new policies got instituted in India that ended up driving investment away and made the business environment quite difficult and also unpredictable. And just name a couple of those: retrospective taxation, local content requirements applied on imports, arbitrary policies in the communication space, and as many would be familiar with here, a patent system that many U.S. companies have found a very lengthy process and one that's quite difficult to work within. I'll come back to some of those concerns later. I wanted to also highlight something that doesn't receive as much attention in our policy community and in the media, and that's some quiet areas of success that showcase where U.S.-India economic cooperation is going very well. First of those, and I would say foremost among those, is clean energy collaboration. We don't always think of this as an economic area of cooperation, but it certainly is. It's core for energy security, economic security, environmental sustainability of both countries. The U.S.-India collaboration on clean energy is one of the biggest successes of the last 5 years. Using a public-private partnership model, challenge grants from the U.S. government and the Indian government have created a joint clean energy research consortium, working on alternative energies, green buildings. More than $2 billion has been mobilized on this front, and there's more work underway in the private sector. Obviously, there's more that can be done in this space, and there's a huge opportunity here, I think, with the new Indian government. The new Prime Minister has spoken about his focus on India's infrastructure development and also on smart cities. So there's a lot that can be done on the smart city front that would make use of clean energy and new technologies there. India's in a position where it can leapfrog now to clean tech as it grows and builds out this $1 trillion infrastructure need over the course of the next decade. That's something that will be important to both countries, supporting India's growth and also supporting the technology and the knowledge of U.S. companies that have developed some pretty cool technologies in the clean energy space. I also want to mention, as I like to mention, and again, this doesn't get the kind of attention I wish it would, is the great collaboration between India and the United States in science and technology. Again, doesn't always come up in conversations about economics, and trade, but S&T is a really important piece and a great success story between India and the United States. Last night's announcement of the successful launch, the successful moving into the Mars orbit of India's Mangalyaan, the Mars orbiter mission, is a great example of that. It's a great example of India's capacity to do frugal, successful technology. The Mangalyaan was created and launched in, the talking point is less than the cost of making the movie Gravity, so an incredible accomplishment. But NASA also has a participating role in this. They've got some instruments that are on the Mangalyaan that will be able to send back information home about the atmosphere on Mars, so that's pretty cool and exciting. Also in S&T, a lot of U.S. S&T research resides in the private sector, in our universities, in our companies, and there are informal collaborations that are going very, very well across the higher ed space and in companies. Our national labs are now learning to work together. I should note also that India, the government of India, will be hosting a science and technology summit in November, and this year the United States is the partner country for that. The third thing I'd like to mention is that despite the many problems over the course of the last couple years in economics and trade, it's now the case that U.S. companies virtually all have an India strategy. You couldn't say that 15 years ago, but you have to say that now. We might hear more complaints at this point because growth has slowed and there have been problems, but India has become important to U.S. corporate strategy in a way that just really wasn't the case half a generation ago. Trade has been doubling every 5 years, now around $100 billion a year in both goods and services. Last summer, Vice President Biden called to try to quintuple, take that level of two-way trade up to $500 billion. Is that achievable? Well, there's a ways to go, obviously, but if you look at what U.S.-China trade is in goods, it's about 10 times what U.S.-India goods trade is, so there's a lot of room for growth. So what can the U.S. government do to try to enhance economic relations with India? I've got a few things that I've been thinking about and that I've written about over the course of the past couple months, and so I'll just briefly touch on those here. First of all, it's critically important on the trade front, where, again, we do have some challenges, to find a shared agenda for collaboration. Among the low-hanging fruit, certainly, one of these would be to get the Trade Policy Forum, which is a bilateral forum for conversation at the cabinet level about trade issues, back on track. This has not met in nearly 4 years, and it needs to meet again. It's my understanding that people are looking for an opportunity to reschedule a meeting for the Trade Policy Forum later this year. The second in the low-hanging fruit category, I would say, would be to, many have argued this, so this is not unique. In fact, there's kind of broad agreement on this matter, quickly complete a bilateral investment treaty. These are called BITs. A BIT has been under discussion between the United States and India really for a decade at this point. It's been hampered by the problem, in fact, a shared problem, that both the United States and India decided to reevaluate the templates for their own model BITs. And unfortunately, both governments did this in a consecutive manner. So, while the United States was reevaluating how it negotiated its own BITs and took a look at the template, negotiations couldn't move forward. And once the U.S. process was completed, India began its own process. So this is really something that could be an important step in looking at ways to further the trade and investment relationship, and it needs to be put back on track and concluded quickly. I've argued elsewhere that the United States should support Indian membership in APEC. I believe that this is an important, in fact, critical move that the U.S. should make. We have a little bit of a political challenge at this point, and that relates to the fact that at the end of July, the government of India decided not to ratify a very difficultly negotiated treaty under the WTO, the Trade Facilitation Agreement. And the problem that has now created is that India is seen as a country that may not be willing to uphold its agreements and might be a difficult partner in a multilateral context. I think some time needs to elapse on this one. I still believe that the economic argument holds. India is a huge economy. It dwarfs some of the economies of the Asia Pacific that are members of APEC, like Papua New Guinea. India should certainly be a member. Right now, I do believe that's a little bit of a political tough sell in the U.S., but we should look to support Indian membership at some point. Because of this problem of that trade facilitation agreement, lack of ratification in India, it's also a little bit difficult at the moment to see how we could move on a more ambitious agenda with India, like a free trade agreement, which some have argued for, or even down the line looking at ways to pull India into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If Prime Minister Modi spurs the reform and the growth that many do expect from him, I hope that we'll see a growing consensus in the United States for a stronger trade framework with India. It's important in the long term. At present, both India and the United States are pursuing different kinds of trade agreements with others that exclude each other, so it ends up leaving us both out in the cold with each other. Let me offer another comment about something that the United States could do. I've written about this elsewhere. India has some complaints about the way the visa process works in the United States. We need to be able to offer some progress on this matter. It concerns India greatly. We probably can't satisfy all of Indians' concerns, but one thing that we could do, well, first I should note that the situation is actually a little bit more positive than many critics suggest. The United States receives the largest number of temporary workers from India, going more to the United States than anywhere else in the world. Of all the temporary workers on the category of visa known as H-1Bs, which comes up for a lot of criticism in India, India actually receives 64% of all the H-1Bs that are issued by the United States. So 64% of all H-1Bs issued globally. The next closest country on that count is China at just 8%. So it really does illustrate how this relationship between the United States and India is much stronger than a lot of the criticism would suggest. But I do think that even in the context of a very difficult environment on Capitol Hill, where comprehensive immigration reform doesn't look like it's going anywhere for some time, certainly won't even be considered until after the November elections, perhaps people could take a look at lifting the H-1B cap, the number of these visas which are allowed for the United States on an annual basis. At this point, the cap is now lower than it was during the Clinton administration. People are also discussing the possibility of global entry for Indian citizens, and we could also take a look at ways of reducing processing delays, particularly for highly skilled scientists, Indian science workers. This is something the National Academies of Science has been talking about for a long time. I'll just touch on a couple other points and then I'll wrap up because I know we need to move on to our other speakers. Prime Minister Modi's priority that he's placing on infrastructure development is really important. It's important for India, and this is an opportunity for the United States as well. Of course, the United States government doesn't direct investment, and this is a big difference between the way the U.S. works and the way other powers like Japan or China work in their engagements internationally. But American companies have a lot of technology to offer, advanced technology on traffic management or green buildings, smart cities, supply chain management, air traffic control, things like that. So because these are ultimately private contracts, there is an opportunity, but it will be a little bit different than the way India's engagement has worked with other countries. But certainly the United States could try to work to see if there are ways to promote, and I know people are interested in doing this, ways to promote opportunities that American companies could then compete for. I mentioned energy earlier, and the U.S. can certainly continue to do more on the clean energy front with India, continuing the joint pursuit of solutions for climate change. Here, this is also a space, since India and the U.S. don't see eye to eye on the multilateral climate change issues, the clean energy component can actually help offset that, and that's a place where the U.S. and India can continue doing more. It's very positive. So those are just a few areas. I could go on at greater length, but I wanted to highlight some of what I think are positive and successful ways to try to overcome some of the differences that we've faced in the last year or so. I'm sure more will come up in Q&A, but I know we have other speakers to get to. Thanks.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was a very succinct presentation, and you highlighted quite a few things which I'm sure people would like to talk about. And then there'll be the counterpart thing as well. I mean, for example, you spoke about the U.S. making it easier for Indians on the visa side. How about the counterpart thing, which is India making it easier for the Americans as well? As some people in this room probably know, it's not always as easy to get a visa for India.
I agree with that.
So now we come to one of the more complicated relationships of India. Bruce Riedel is going to discuss with us the India-US-Pakistan triangle, which is no longer that much of a triangle according to some people, but it still remains significant. The impact of US relationship with Pakistan on its relationship with India, and the Indian relationship with the US and its impact on Pakistan. And I would like you to discuss it, Bruce, in the backdrop of Pakistan's military intelligence establishment's continued use of what you have yourself described as terrorist brinkmanship. So, to what extent is terrorism an area of cooperation between the United States, I mean counterterrorism, an area of cooperation between Pakistan and between India and the United States? And to what extent is terrorism an issue that is an important issue for this relationship? And how does America's attitude and past relationship with Pakistan impact the relationship in general? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Husain. I am going to focus on the U.S.-Indian counterterrorism and security relationship, but before I focus on that in particular, I want to highlight something that the two previous speakers have also highlighted. The U.S.-Indian relationship today is transformed in ways that even a decade ago, and certainly 2 decades ago, no one would have thought we would be where we are today. For those who don't remember, we went 22 years between visits by American presidents in the last quarter of the 20th century. It would be unthinkable for any American president, frankly, for any American politician, not to find their way to India today. It is transformed in ways that are just remarkable to those of us who've watched it for a long time. But I want to focus on the terrorism issue, and let me spend my time looking at 2 incidents in particular, because I think they raise very profound questions about the future of terrorism and the risk and the threat from terrorism in South Asia today, and then speak about what the U.S. and India might be able to do about them. And of course, they both involve Pakistan. The first incident took place at the end of May. There was an attack by a heavily armed squad of terrorists on the Indian consulate in Herat, Afghanistan. The terrorists were able to penetrate inside the outer perimeter of the consulate, but then fortunately they were all killed by the Indian consulate security guards from the Indo-Tibet Border Security Organization. From information and equipment found on their persons, it is easy to say in retrospect what the intention of these terrorists were. They planned to penetrate into the consulate and take Indian diplomats prisoner, and then hold them hostage and probably kill them over the course of the next 72 hours in the build-up to the inauguration of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, we know what happened in the real world in which they were killed. Imagine in the alternative world if on the eve of the inauguration of a new prime minister, Indian diplomats were being systematically murdered by a bunch of terrorists in Afghanistan. It would have changed the entire dynamic of the situation. It would certainly have provoked a very interesting conflict between India and Pakistan at the eve of this important event. The United States State Department, a week or so after the attack, came out with another blockbuster. The terrorists involved in the attack were members of Lashkar-e-Taiba, the terrorist organization based in Pakistan that carried out, of course, the attack on Mumbai in November 2008, known as 26/11. We don't exactly know why the State Department decided to inform the rest of the world that Lashkar-e-Taiba was involved. We can speculate on that. It's a very interesting thing. The State Department doesn't often offer such detailed information about events, terrorist events overseas, but I think there's every reason to believe it was true. If indeed, and I think it's safe to say Lashkar-e-Taiba was involved in this attack, that it planned to carry out something like this on the eve of the inauguration of the Prime Minister, it raises profound questions about who in the Pakistani military and security establishment was in on the plot as well. We know from previous incidents like Mumbai 2008 that Lashkar-e-Taiba works hand in glove with the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI. There is every reason to believe that an attack in Herat, Afghanistan at a critical juncture like this would have had the foreknowledge of at least the Pakistani intelligence services. And as I've argued in a number of books, that means the foreknowledge of the Pakistani high command in the army. What were their purposes? What did they have in mind? What did they think this was going to accomplish? Equally important, did they plan to do this in order to embarrass their own prime minister, Nawaz Sharif, who of course was invited to go to the inauguration of the Indian prime minister? That would be very much reminiscent of November 2008, in which one of the main purposes of the attack on Mumbai was to critically injure the political position of then Pakistani leader Zardari. The whole point here is that this incident raises profound questions about who in Pakistan was intending to carry out one of the most grievous acts of international terrorism just a few months ago. Let me bring forward to the second incident, which happened earlier this month. Just after Al-Qaeda leader Ayman Zawahiri announced that a new Al-Qaeda franchise had been created up, or Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. Believe me, in Arabic it sounds it's much prettier in Arabic than Al-Qaeda in the Islamic subcontinent. It's just, the English translation doesn't do it service. Just after that announcement, there was an attack by this group on the Pakistani naval base in Karachi. We now know a few details about the attack, although there is much that remains unclear. The purpose of the attack, according to Al-Qaeda, was to hijack a Pakistani frigate, a Chinese-built frigate, the PNS Zulfikar, armed with cruise missiles capable of being fired several hundred kilometers against other ships at sea. The intention of Al-Qaeda was to hijack this vessel, take it out into the Indian Ocean, and then move up close to an American naval vessel and open fire. That may be a fanciful and hard-to-accomplish mission, but that is certainly a very elaborate plot and one which would have had profound implications. We also know that this was an inside job, that the terrorists who were trying to hijack the vessel were in fact members of the Pakistani Navy. They were able to get onto the naval vessel because they had all the appropriate protocols and badges that allowed them in. This too raises very important questions. How deeply is the Pakistani military penetrated by Al-Qaeda and other groups? What is the intention of Al-Qaeda vis-a-vis these penetrations towards Pakistan's nuclear weapons arsenal? What is Al-Qaeda's intention of dealing with India in the future, and how significant could it use penetrations of the Pakistani military to carry out such attacks? All of these are profound and important questions for American and Indian counterterrorism and security officials to think about. These two incidents, taking place in the less than 6 months, have to leave us with a judgment that we're going to see more such incidents in the future. Lashkar-e-Taiba has paid no price for what it did in Herat last May. In fact, the head of Lashkar-e-Taiba appears on television more than probably all of the people on this panel collectively appear on television. Despite the fact that there is a bounty looking for his information to his arrest, the man doesn't appear to be in any sense of danger. Another thing I would say, Prime Minister Modi, his very persona, his past, the histories about him, perceptions for and against him attract Islamic extremist thinking. Modi, as an extremely successful Indian politician, known to be a strong nationalist, known to be a strong believer in the BJP ideology, is going to attract the attention of extremists from Islamic movements like Lashkar-e-Taiba, like Al-Qaeda. That's not meant to blame Prime Minister Modi in any way. It's inevitable in who he is that enemies of that are going to try to take it down. What can the U.S. and India do about this together? Well, here again, the good news, as my two previous speakers laid out, is a lot has been done. Intelligence cooperation, security cooperation between the United States and India has been transformed in the last 6 years. If you look at what we did normally before November 2008 and what we do normally today, it's a sea change in activity. Just to give you one example, the very first place that President Obama's first director of Central Intelligence, Leon Panetta, went on a foreign trip was India. That was done deliberately, and it was meant as a signal not only to India, but also as a signal to the ISI. How many times directors of Central Intelligence foreign travel are previewed to the press is pretty rare, the very fact of doing that. Nonetheless, it's my judgment that much more still can be done. There's much more that we need to look into in terms of intelligence sharing of information, intelligence cooperation, and specifically about the most immediate threats that we both face, which are all based in Pakistan, and how we intend to try to deal with those threats and the unique challenge posed by the ISI relationship with groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba. There's also a challenge ahead in Afghanistan. As US and NATO forces draw down increasingly in Afghanistan, perhaps to zero by the beginning of 2017, which I think would be a grave mistake, but that is the course we're on today, we, the United States and India, need to think about how we're going to help to try to fill the security vacuum that is inevitably going to come from the withdrawal of NATO and American forces out of there. Finally, I think there's also work that should be done in the realm of crisis management planning. Another crisis between India and Pakistan is inevitable, in my judgment. If you look at the track record of the last quarter of a century, we average one every 5 years or so. Let's not plan on how we're going to manage that crisis when the crisis begins. Let's start thinking about how to manage a crisis like that well in advance.
That was very cheerful.
That wasn't in, you didn't send me a memo saying cheerful.
No. We wanted accuracy. We want truthfulness and accuracy for the integrity of analysis. I think reversing the order a little bit with Sadanand's permission, since we've just discussed Pakistan in part, shall we go to China first? So Tanvi Madan is going to discuss the China factor in the India-US relationship. There are people who see India as a counterweight to China, those who are convinced that China is a rising power and will be a strategic threat to the United States global leadership at some point. So let's discuss that, especially in the context that President Xi was recently in India and now Prime Minister Modi is in the United States. And please try and stick to 10, 12 minutes. There's a clock right across.
Thank you, Sen, and I will try very hard to stay in my time. What I'm going to do is talk a little broadly about how China plays into kind of the India-US relationship, and then specifically look at the question that Husain just posed about President Xi Jinping's visit and what that might mean for the visit moving forward, just on this weekend, but also beyond it over the next few months and years. Firstly, I'd just like to kind of broadly say that India-US relations are partly driven by and shaped by the two countries' perceptions of the other's relationships and their own relationships with China. In some ways, there's a bit of a Goldilocks principle at work on both sides. Neither India nor the US want to see the other's relations with China be either too hot or too cold. On the US side, you see this with the US has an interest in a stable China-India relationship, especially given the other tensions in Asia and the world broadly, including in the Middle East and Europe. Moreover, the U.S. won't necessarily mind if Chinese investment in India leads to a better Indian economy and better infrastructure that can be of benefit to American companies and business broadly as well. On the other hand, the U.S. has no interest in seeing India get too close to China. It wouldn't like to see China dominate the Indian economy and Chinese companies be major competitors to American companies. And it wouldn't really like to see China and India form a tag team, whether with Russia or in various multilateral forums. And you see this play out, this kind of Goldilocks principle play out on the Indian side as well. You hear often Indian concerns about a G2, about China and the US. Behaving in a very close collaborative fashion, and the idea being that this would be done in a way that not just left India out, but they would act in a fashion that would be to India's detriment. And you kind of see a different manifestation of this when you see, you hear concerns about, well, is the U.S. Really a reliable partner in terms of sending China a message? When push comes to shove, the U.S. will always choose its relationship with China because that's a more economically interdependent one, and it's all very well in words, but in actions, the U.S. won't be reliable. And you do hear this. On the other hand, you also don't want to see, you see Indian officials say, and behave in a manner that says we don't want to see China-U.S. tensions get too bad because it potentially causes instability in the entire region, which negatively could potentially impact India and the achievement of India's domestic goals. So you see this at play, and I think there is another dimension about why neither the U.S. nor India would like to see tension between the other and China. And that's because that would mean that they might be asked to choose between the two, which neither one wants to do. India doesn't want to be asked to choose between China and the U.S., and the reverse as well. There's another dimension at play here as well, where kind of China feeds into the broader U.S.-India relationship. And that is, in some ways, there's a realization on both sides that China, not in a necessarily an active way, but as a factor, drives interest in the US and India, and in India in the US, and creates importance for the other country. So for the Indian leadership, I mean, they recognize that American concerns in various constituencies about either the rise of China and the way that's happening, questions about Chinese intentions in some cases, and even questions and concerns about the nature of the Chinese government actually create constituencies for India and the US, and they find this useful. On the other hand, you see how for India, their concerns about China's rise, whether it's going to be peaceful or not, questions about Chinese intention actually creates importance or generates a certain sense of importance for the US in India. Again, creates constituencies in a few different ways. I mean, one is this idea that the US is one of the few countries that can really help shape China's rise in a way that India would like to see. India does not like the idea that some have argued, the Xi vision of Asia, as with the US playing less of a role and China dominant. That is not a view of vision of Asia that Prime Minister Modi shares, and he's made that quite clear. Another way, so it's kind of the offshore balancer or the pivotal role of the US in Asia, which you have increasingly heard Indian officials publicly talk about, saying we want a stronger US role in the Asia Pacific. There's a couple of other ways that a good relationship with the US is seen to redound to the benefit of India's relations with a few other countries in the Asia Pacific, including China. It sends a signal. And there's another kind of useful way that Indian officials will say that good relations with the US giving India importance, actually has benefited India's relations with Japan and countries like Australia as well. So the fact that China is this element actually facilitates that relationship. I think you do see there is a third aspect to this question as well, which is that the three countries do share some interest. I mean, China and India and the US don't, I mean, the triangle, because it's so complex, one of the areas, Afghanistan is an area, for example, where all three countries see stability as being in their interests. The Middle East is another area. Now, the difficulties come in how you actually get to that stability. And in the case of Afghanistan, this is where the Pakistan dimension comes in, is how that link plays out. What is China, how does it see, and what is it willing to do to ensure a certain role that Pakistan plays vis-a-vis Afghanistan? But there are these areas that the three countries could act together. Energy security is another one, and we'll wait and see. Not sure it's in this context that we'll see much movement on this, but potentially in the future if the three countries act together. On Xi's visit, President Xi Jinping was in India over the last week. The visit was followed what many saw as a fairly successful Modi visit to Japan. What got overshadowed was what many considered a fairly successful visit by the Indian president to Vietnam. And I would encourage everybody to actually go and look at that, what happened there, because that is a very significant country in terms of how Mr. Modi seems to be seeing the Asia Pacific. But the Xi visit, I mean, I think many of you have probably heard kind of the postmortems of the visit, and I think we'll be hearing about that for a while. Let me just highlight kind of positive and negative elements. I think there was a positive element, though it's getting lost in the various kind of postmortems, and that's on the economic side. The $20 billion of commitment that was promised, because of the expectation set, maybe doesn't look that big. But if you consider the current level of Chinese investment in India, which is about less than $500 million, that's a significant jump. You did see also some amount of the leadership trying to convey that they take India more seriously. But that was kind of offset and in some ways overshadowed by a couple of things. One was the expectation setting, which was a bit surprising that the Chinese officials did this, which was the expectation setting on the economic side. Usually the protocol is not to declare outcomes before actual visits. In this case, you had Chinese officials both in Delhi and Bombay actually previewing $100 billion plus of commitments that could potentially be made. I'm not going to get into the details of why they might not have been made and why this happened, but what that did is set expectations, especially when these officials also explicitly compared that commitment to the Japanese commitment of $35 billion over 7 years, saying, look, we're actually going to beat that. So that created expectations. So the $20 billion, which would otherwise have been considered a pretty good deliverable, looked kind of, it paled in comparison. The other thing was, and significantly, the incident at the border that is still ongoing. And it is one thing that this happened last year in April, just before Premier Li Keqiang visited India. And there was another border incident this time. I think we're still trying to figure out what exactly happened, why this border incident took place. And I think we'll see that question play out for a while. What did happen is that it did overshadow the visit. You saw on every split screen, on every Indian news channel, the visit on the one hand, with all the ceremony, and the border incident playing out on the other. I think you also saw this reinforce the many questions in India amongst the elite and public about Chinese intentions over the long term, whether it takes India seriously, and also whether this was a way of trying to bully the new government and send a certain signal. I think there's also an argument to be made that this was a lost opportunity for President Xi with Prime Minister Modi, who I can't imagine expected to issue the statement that he ended up issuing on the visit, which was heavily focused on sensitivities rather than talking about economic opportunity and talking about the border incident much more than I suspect they would have otherwise liked to. And I think if this is going to be an era of very personal diplomacy, I think the Chinese leadership has lost a chance. In many ways, if this was coming from a tactical perspective, it's a strategic loss, I think, in many ways. It might be a strategic loss for China. I think this could be an opportunity for India-US relations. And not in a very active sense. I don't think this should be about choices or playing one off against each other, but it does create a certain opportunity. For India, there's always been, and I'm going to wrap up in a couple of minutes, Husain, just in case I'm running over time. This creates an opportunity for actually thinking about, on the strategic side, where Mr. Modi wants to take the relationship with the US. In some ways, there's always been this sense in the Indian government from the late 40s through now of whether preparation, including building partnerships in Asia, will be seen as provocation in China. We have seen, and that might still exist, that you can see some arguing that maybe President Xi and others were concerned about Mr. Modi's outreach to Japan, etc. This was a way of saying that, listen, we have certain ideas about this too. Having said that, we have seen the Modi government not be afraid to send signals, including with inviting Tibetan leadership to the government swearing in. We have seen a fairly strong statement from the foreign minister saying that China needed to have a one India policy, just like India has a one China policy. We've seen, and I would encourage you to read the joint declaration, India-Vietnam declaration, when Pranab Mukherjee, the president, went to Vietnam, which almost for the first time mentions the South China Sea and the East China Sea very explicitly and talks about freedom of navigation. And you saw the statement from the prime minister as well. So they're not afraid to send signals. And so this might not stop. Another signal could be potentially reaching out to the US and not letting, so in three ways, kind of trying to leverage the relationship with the US to send a signal to China. And this could happen in three ways. One is psychological, to actually say a good visit, we're not going to let China hold us back from having a closer relationship with the US. This is not business as usual. Second is geopolitical, to kind of play the balancing game and have good relations with not just the US, but US allies and partners. The third is kind of in a more physical infrastructure sense. India could look to the US to help with its infrastructure development near the border areas, as well as in its military modernization. So what does this mean for the US? I think there's a real opportunity, especially with this visit. There will be contrasts. And I think so for the opportunity for the US, and I think many recognize this, many acknowledge this, to have this visit not just be about kind of substance, but optics as well, to show that in some ways, implicitly, India's rise is something the US supports. That unlike China, this is something that the US recognizes, and as Alyssa pointed out, that there is strategic consensus on this. I think the US can also facilitate India's relationships with its allies and partners in the Asia Pacific. I don't think it should play a very active role. It should, because this will not be welcome necessarily. But I think where it can, when it comes to these questions, that it should facilitate, including a larger role in some of the Asian regional organizations. I think the final thing is to make clear, both rhetorically and in action, not just where the administration's Asia policy lies, but India's role in it. There will be questions in India about reliability. Indians will watch President Obama's trip to China very carefully. But overall, I think this is an opportunity to improve at least discussions on that end.
Thank you. And now finally, Sadanand Dhume, you have been actually writing about what you see as Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy goals, the potential for economic cooperation in particular. And I would like you to address all those things and summarize them in 10 articulate minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Husain, for having me here. And I have to congratulate you on your smart move of inviting my wife too, to ensure that I'm on my best behavior. And so I'm going to do my best to stick to the time limit, and hopefully then we can get to Q&A. I'm going to make three very broad points about the visit from the economic perspective. The first is that economics is absolutely central to the success of this visit, for the simple reason that economics was central to Narendra Modi's appeal as a candidate and the fact that he's Prime Minister today. The second point is that though it is still early days, we've basically, the government has been in office for only about 4 months. So far on economics, the Modi government has sent out mixed messages. There's a glass half full aspect, but there's also a glass half empty aspect, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And the third point I'm going to make is that Modi's window to get the economics right is actually quite small. And I'm going to talk about why that is the case, particularly in comparison with his predecessor, Manmohan Singh. First point, why is economics central to this visit? For the simple reason that it is central to Modi's own appeal as a candidate first and now as a prime minister. Just before the election, I was traveling in Uttar Pradesh and I went to Varanasi, where Modi himself was standing for parliament. And one of the things that I was struck by in my conversations with people over there was the sense of optimism about him. Just if you were sort of from a distance just reading the opinion pages of the Indian opinion pages, the sense you got was there's this really contentious debate going on. But when you went there, and particularly in UP, which of course voted overwhelmingly for the BJP, there was such a sense of hope. And I wrote a piece which was headlined in the Wall Street Journal, Indians Vote for Hope. And that really was what this election was about, in my view. And if you look at polls, you see that it's supported by the fact that overwhelmingly people were concerned about jobs and inflation. Economic issues were central to this. There was a very complex debate about the Gujarat model that went on in the pages of the domestic and international press. But on the ground, clearly Modi won that debate. His idea that his rule in Gujarat resulted in 24 hours electricity, good roads, jobs, is exactly what won in the public imagination and helped him to get elected with this overwhelming majority by Indian standards, at least, and end the coalition era. Indeed, if we were to go back just 5 years, there were leading people who were leading commentators close to the BJP who were wondering whether the BJP would ever come back to power again. This was not a party that was on the ascendant. This was a party that was in decline, having lost 2 successive elections, without a clear leadership, with its philosophical moorings in question. And here you had this person who campaigned on the back of his economic performance and turned it around and became prime minister. So the economics is really important for him to get right in Washington. A second point is that so far the messages that Modi has sent out, particularly to the international community on where he stands on economics, I would say it's a mixed bag. On the positive side, you've seen a slight uptick in growth. It's now at its fastest pace in 2 years. It's touching almost 6% in terms of quarterly growth. You have seen some capacity for bold action. For example, in his Independence Day speech, Modi announced that he was scrapping the Planning Commission, a relic of Nehruvian socialism. He has allowed the the government to shut down a loss-making watch manufacturer, HMT watches. And so there is a sense there that this is a person who would be willing to do things that are certainly bolder than his predecessor. At the same time, you see that clearances have been speeded up considerably. There's a new sense of purpose in the bureaucracy. There is, the stock market is booming. Businessmen, if you speak with them, have rarely been so optimistic about India. There's a real kind of bullishness that India now has a leader with a can-do attitude, and that can-do attitude is going to translate into a much better business climate and get India moving again. On the glass half empty side, the most obvious thing is that we have not yet seen major reforms. Now, I personally hold the view that it's way too early to judge. I don't think any Indian government has been judged within the first 4 months. So it's too early to come to any kind of sort of definitive conclusion. But the fact is that there was a view put out during the election campaign, and I was one of the people putting that out, which essentially viewed Modi's silence or ambivalence on some issues of economic reform as realpolitik. Well, of course, Modi is not going to say anything against the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, because how could he say that and hope to be elected? Of course, he's not going to oppose the food security bill, which provides subsidized grains to 2/3 of the population, because that would be daft. Of course, he's not going to run on a campaign of privatization, because come on, this is India. This is not Thatcher's Britain. But there was a sense that behind all of this, the kind of people he had surrounded himself with, if you looked at his advisors and if you looked at his supporters, that in fact Modi would have an economic program that was, for want of a better term, considerably to the right of what his campaign rhetoric suggested. 4 months in, it has to be said that those expectations have not been met, and perhaps you can make the case that those who put out that view were being overly optimistic. There is no move to reform labor laws, at least at the central level. Modi, in fact, has spoken against privatization, most recently to Fareed Zakaria, where he said that, well, I could just get these state-owned companies to work better as I did in Gujarat. And the budget was quite a damp squib. Even on the one issue that I would argue there is broad consensus on was the most disastrous policy put in place by the Indian government ever since economic reforms in 1991, which is the so-called retroactive taxes they put in place in 2012. The Modi government has not repealed the retroactive taxes. It has simply suggested that it doesn't like them very much. Similarly, Modi's two key slogans during his campaign, which raised a lot of hopes, one was maximum governance, minimum government, and the second was that the government has no business being in business. If these two slogans were to be translated into policy terms, I think you would see major reform. We haven't seen that yet. Now, why is this important? I think it's particularly important. I mean, so if you put this argument forward, people from the other side push back and say, well, you know, this is like a cricket match, and there are plenty of Indians in the audience, so I'll use a cricket analogy. This is like a cricket match. It's a 5-day test match. He's been elected for 5 years. Don't treat it like a T20, a 3-hour match. Don't judge him too quickly. And to be fair, there's some merit in that argument. It's true that he's been elected for 5 years, and he's not going to you can't judge him that quickly. But there is also a context. And the context is that Modi has been elected at a very difficult time for India. I'm not sure if some of you saw the most recent World Economic Forum's global competitive rankings, where India essentially fell 11 places to number 71 in the world. It's right now the last among the BRICS economies. So Modi has not inherited an economic situation which was comparable to the economic situation inherited by Manmohan Singh, who had a healthy government balance sheet, growth on the uptake, investors already interested. He has inherited a situation where the past few years, particularly for the period from 2011 onwards, has raised questions about the political will of India's leadership and what this means for India's economy. So that's the first part. The second is that I think that as a result of this, I think that India, at least among foreign companies, gets less benefit of doubt now than it did earlier. I've often criticized this idea of Davos man, where you have this one argument that is being put forth by politicians in Hindi on the stump, which is, what more can I give you a free TV, and can I give you a free fridge, and can I give you a free boiler, and what have you? And then you have this other argument being put forward very articulately, by someone in a suit and tie in Davos, which is that this is all about economic reform and we're going ahead. But the last 10 years of Congress rule showed that that is not sustainable. You have to pay attention to what the politician says to his own people in his own language, and that is only right. That's how it should be in a democracy. But it does mean that the patience for this kind of mixed messaging, where one message is being put out domestically and another one internationally, has worn thin, and Modi is not going to be a beneficiary of that. So he's going to have to show concrete results much sooner than his predecessor. The third and final point before I wrap up is that though Modi himself has a positive image in terms of among businessmen and among economists for his rather good job of handling the Gujarat economy, he is not going to enjoy the kind of honeymoon that Manmohan Singh did, for the simple reason that Manmohan Singh was viewed as the architect of liberalization. When in 1991, when in 2004, when Manmohan Singh became prime minister, that was the headline everywhere. And it took a long, long time. I would argue it took about 7 or 8 years before people figured out that Manmohan Singh, the prime minister, and Manmohan Singh, the finance minister, were very different beasts. And the reason they were very different beasts is that Manmohan Singh, the finance minister, had a prime minister who was above him, committed to reform, whereas Manmohan Singh, the prime minister, had a leader in Ten Janpath who was maybe not quite as committed to reform. So, to sum up, what I'm getting at over here is that the economics is central to Modi. He has done things, and there is reason to believe that this is a person who can get it done. Certainly in the Indian political spectrum, he represents the best hope of a turnaround. But I think the analogy that this is a test match and that therefore the judgment will be that he should be judged slowly, while it has some merit, actually is not based on reality, because people outside, particularly in corporations, are more impatient today with India than they were a few years ago. Thank you.
Great. We have had 5 excellent presentations, a lot of food for thought for everyone. I am happy to open this for questions and answers. Before we go, just a short comment based on what Sadanand just said. I mean, on the American side, one can argue that what the American and Indian encounter is in some ways an encounter between a civilization known for its patience and a culture not necessarily known for much patience. So Americans would definitely want results much sooner on all things when they get serious about it. Of course, what Bruce said was there are certain issues on which perhaps the Americans have spent too much time not taking swift enough action, the terrorism side. So these are all questions that come out of this conversation. Please raise your hand, state your institutional affiliation, and ask a question. I will first take questions, and then if we still have time, I will let you guys make comments. But the difference between a question and a comment is usually known to people. But in Washington, D.C., I've discovered that there is a lack of understanding. So a question normally ends with a question mark, and it actually is something interrogative rather than just a long spiel about how you feel on the subject, for which you are more than welcome to send us an email. And if you fit our criteria, we'll have you on a panel someday. So questions, please. Yes, sir, in the middle.
I'm Mac Dessler from the Maryland School of Public Policy. Noting that almost nothing has been said about trade policy in this panel, does Prime Minister Modi have any strong declared position, intentions in this area?
Trade policy. Sadanand.
I think what's dominated the discussion on trade policy, frankly, has been India's stand at the WTO on the trade facilitation agreement. Now, Modi has spoken about the importance of trade, he has spoken about how he has sort of harked back to medieval Indian rulers who cared about trade, particularly maritime trade. He governed Gujarat, which is arguably India's most outward-looking and trade-friendly state. But it's not clear that this makes him a free trader. Clearly, trade is going to be important to his idea of economic policy, but if we were to go by the TFA agreement, or the lack of one rather, I think he's going to remain particularly sensitive to domestic constituencies. And so in a sense, what putting that together with his idea of make in India, it seems like trade is important, but he wants to build a manufacturing base and wants to sort of pursue Indian manufacturing strength and not simply open up trade across the board.
Tanvi,
I'd just-
how is that different from China, for example,
I think,
when
mean,
they
I-
started out?
I think in many cases, the Chinese-driven the economy was very trade-driven, and I think, but we do see the difference in terms of, India's, and of course China's now, and other countries, including Japan, have tried to encourage domestic markets. For the longest time, the argument was India had a big enough domestic market. So what was made in India? The one issue that you underlying the make in India is you want to make in India on the positive side, but you don't want to get to the stage where there's some danger of slipping into import substitution language, which, when you're hearing the Independence Day speech, you could interpret it that way. So I think, it is different. Having said that, and in some ways, Prime Minister Modi has talked with great admiration of Chinese economic achievement, but he's also made it very clear that India is different, and this was most recently, of course, articulated explicitly in his interview with Fareed Zakaria this weekend. But even when he went to China and returned, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he made that quite clear that because of exactly the domestic constituencies that...
Yes, Ambassador Kapur wants to
Sorry.
say something. Sorry.
Professor Desla, I would just like to discuss it from another paradigm. There is trade policy and there's trade. Now, Modi's focus is not going to be to get involved with the difficult issues of trade policy globally, but he has already sent out very clear signals that he's very focused on the aspects of trade. He will be meeting a large number of important CEOs while he's here in the US. He's called in CEOs of various organizations for meetings, including the chairman of BlackRock, for example, the IBM, the General Electric, Goldman & Sachs, Google, PepsiCo,
Ambassador-
Carlyle Group, Cargill, Citigroup, Merck, Caterpillar,
Ambassador
across the
Kapur,
broad range.
I think we understand what you're saying, but I think Professor Chester's
And-
question was very specific about trade policy, so we should keep the question more focused.
Well, with such a important market, in the sense that India would be one of the global drivers of the global economy, and we have a very young population, he's going to be more focused on that. There is a lot of hiatus in our trade policy organization in India due to whatever has been inherited by the Modi government. We have heard discussions from Sadanand, for example, about the budget. Now, I was reading a very interesting article about how the budget formulation was made with Arun Jaitley, the Minister of Finance, giving clear-cut instructions to all his bureaucrats, including the secretaries of the Ministry of Finance, that he wanted a very dynamic budget, a very robust budget, a very different budget. And how it started off with those instructions and those directions, and how with all the arguments which were put forth by all these secretaries and these joint secretaries in the Ministry of Finance, it became a budget which was very different from what was originally thought about.
Alyssa, you wanted to say something?
I did want to address that. I actually spoke at great length in my presentation. I think that the trade issues are at the center of many of the most contentious bilateral disagreements between India and the United States. It is certainly the case that the Indian economy is much more open now than it was in 1991, but it is not fully open. There are still some sectors that have caps put on foreign direct investment. Many of these are issues between India and the United States, or rather India and many countries, but they're certainly issues that American officials raise and are issues about which American businesses have concerns. One of the things that the Indian government is focused on doing, as Tanvi just said, is developing a manufacturing sector. India needs to create jobs for its demography, creating between 10 and 12 million jobs per year for people rising of workforce age. And the previous government, and this is certainly to continue forward with the new government, would like to do that through growing its manufacturing sector, which currently does not have the capacity to do that at the moment. Instead of creating programs that would be designed to build a manufacturing sector through an incentive-based program, the previous government, and we don't yet know what the Modi government will do on this count, but the previous government focused on local content requirements to try to compel foreign companies to produce a fixed percentage of whatever their goods were in India, instead of saying, hey, we'll give you an incentive if you come and operate and build a factory in our state, then you can have this incentive package, the way many countries around the world work. So these are also at issue. When you apply local content requirements, that actually creates a barrier to imports from around the world. So that's an issue that people discuss. The multilateral trade issues are actually quite contentious. We've got 3 disputes underway in the WTO right now with India. I don't know where those stand at the moment. I think they've moved into panel. But these are very significant differences. Of course, you always have more trade differences when you trade more with countries. We've got a lot of differences with Canada, for example. But that's one of the reasons that it will be really important for the U.S. and India to have deeper and more detailed conversations about those differences and try to find ways to bridge them.
Okay. Next question. Yes, please, in the middle, Seema Sirohi.
Hi, my question is for Bruce Riedel. You painted a picture that's quite chilling as to the penetration of the Pakistani armed forces by the jihadi elements. So the logical question would be, what would it take for US policy to actually change towards Pakistan, the way it transformed towards India? I mean, what are we waiting for?
I raised questions about the extent of penetration. We don't actually know how dangerous the situation is. We do know that the Pakistani Navy in particular seems to have a track record of penetration by Al-Qaeda and like-minded groups. What will change American policy towards Pakistan could be the subject of a 2-hour conference, and we would barely begin to cover it.
We will arrange that someday, Bruce. So let's just remain focused on Prime Minister Modi and the US and what could be discussed during this visit.
In that context, I think the immediate issue is going to be Afghanistan. When the United States was dependent upon Pakistan for supplying 100,000 American troops in Afghanistan, there was certain limitations and constraints on U.S. policy. Those constraints are going to be gone. And to a large extent, they already are gone, but they are steadily going to change. Secondly, with a new Afghan government, there's an opportunity for U.S.-India collaboration in support of that government, which I think is a major opening here. How we then collectively deal with the Pakistan challenge is one that I think Modi and President Obama should explore a great deal over the course of the next several weeks. Let me be clear about one thing. I'm not advocating ganging up on Pakistan. I don't think that would work. I think that would feed into the worst paranoid conspiracy theories. What I am talking about is having a serious conversation between two countries about the problems posed in a third country and how you think you're going to adapt to them and deal with them over the course of time.
Good. Next question. Yes, young lady at the back.
This is kind of a long question, so bear with me. Okay, so many U.S. businesses have voiced concerns in the past few years about the business
Could you
environment.
speak a little louder? We can't hear you.
Many U.S. businesses have voiced concerns in the past few years about the business environment in India, in particular with respect to India's policies on intellectual property and forced localization. Many hope the Modi government will be more open and business-focused than the previous government, but India's actions blocking the trade facilitation agreement at the WTO suggested those hopes may be misplaced. Do you think the new government has the interest and ability to tackle difficult issues like respect for intellectual property and forced localization?
Would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Oh, I'm Gada. I'm working with Aiken Gump.
Okay. You want to have a quick shot at that?
I think,
you already answered it.
Yeah, I think
partly,
this has
but-
already been answered in parts, but I'll just sort of, quickly say that I don't think that IPR issues are going to be resolved entirely to the satisfaction of the US. And I think it's important that some of these very narrow sectoral concerns, though sometimes they do have merit, that these narrow sectoral concerns don't hijack the larger relationship. There is more to not just the US-India relationship, but there's more to the US-India economic relationship than sort of very narrow concern that often is being driven not even by an industry, but by maybe one or two firms within an industry. Jury is still out on preferential market access. I would hope that the Modi government makes India a more attractive place to manufacture by making it easier to acquire land, by easing some labor law restrictions and so on. We're beginning to see signs of some reform in the states, such as in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, which is being encouraged by New Delhi. And certainly seems that cutting down red tape is going to be a part of it. So I think the emphasis is probably going to be more on making India a better place to manufacture, as it should be. But it's not entirely clear to me whether this government is going to give up the blunt instrument of preferential market access.
Next. Yes, sir.
My name's Shane Mason from the Simpson Center, and I have a question for Mr. Riedel. In the events of another crisis between India and Pakistan that's precipitated by a terrorist attack in India emanating or having links with Pakistan, what options do you think India has to either respond to this or to deter future attacks? And what role do you think the United States will play in future crises between India and Pakistan?
Let me flip that, take the second part. The United States has played a critical part in dealing with these kind of crises now going back to 1990. There are even those who argue that we have a playbook that can just be pulled off the shelves that tells us what to do. In my experience in government, and I'll ask Alicia if she has the same one, usually you can't find the playbook. It's in it went to the Little Rock Presidential Library, and they can't, they don't work on weekends. But we have a lot of experience at it. But going to the first part of the question, I think time is, if not run out, pretty close. It's very hard for me to imagine how any Indian government, confronted with another terrorist attack of the magnitude of Mumbai 26/11, or had that attack in Herat been successful, will be able to simply stand back and say, well, we're going to turn the other cheek, or we're going to look for international isolation. I think the time on that has probably run out. Now, I'm sure that inside the Defense Ministry and the Intelligence Bureau and Research and Analysis Wing, there are people working round the clock trying to come up with options. And I suspect they have already begun to put forward a menu of options, which could go from something as relatively benign as a quarantine of Pakistani ports. Well, we did that once in a crisis, to some kind of limited military action. But all of those raise the same questions that have been raised in every Indo-Pakistani crisis since 1990, which is, once you start the escalatory ladder, how do you prevent it from going too far? And no one has a particularly good answer to that. My bottom line is it would be much better for the United States and India to have serious conversations about these kind of situations today, not on the weekend when they blow up on them, and not on the weekend when you can't find the playbook because you misplaced it.
Wait, Sam, can I just add a quick note?
Sure, quick.
I think Bruce is being a bit modest here, and for all the students in the room, do a quick Google on the 1999 Kargil crisis, and you will find Bruce's paper that he did some years ago for the Center for the Advanced Study of India that lays out in detail his personal recollection of President Clinton's crisis diplomacy, in fact, during the actual Kargil crisis, and the role that the United States played in helping to defuse that.
Although things have changed considerably since then, we now have the prospect of tactical nuclear weapons in the arena as well. So it's a little more complicated. But yes, Bruce does have some very good insights into what happened there. Sir, here in the front. Yes?
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I always love attending Hudson, but you have those group people who come who really care about the topic, national security, ask good questions. And those other people come who cares about India or whatever the subject is, and we want to pick the brains of those people who know a hell of a lot more about India than I do. I'm the second. So my question concerns India and China, but in what I consider a unique way. A lot of people are very concerned about the Chinese threat in Africa. Most times you talk to the Chinese people, China, they say, no, we're fighting the Indians. We want to have the same type of fifth column, meaning many Chinese living in Africa, so we can have the kind of relationship that India has with the amount of expat Indians who live there. Does India have much of a policy as Africa? They certainly have a presence when you go to each one of the countries, but politically, I don't see them with the same type of summits. They have some summits, but the same kind of push. Is India interested in Africa, and do they view it as competition with China?
Who's going to take that? Tanvi, you want to have a quick shot?
And then I think
Ambassador Kapur can have a quick one as well.
Firstly, I think India does have historic links with Africa in a way that China does not. Goes back to British imperialism and Indians who went over at that time. India does not see Africa as just as a monolithic continent. The presence is very different. The links are very different in different parts. More obviously with countries that were formerly ruled by the Brits than, for example, with the French. I think there is an effort to reach out on a more consistent basis, even in collaboration with the U.S. Yesterday, the Indian Foreign Ministry spokesperson talked about the U.S. and India collaborating in 3 areas, kind of in third countries areas, and one of them was potentially Africa. I think it's not just driven by China. It is more a question of Indian, not just historic links, but Indian businesses wanting to seek markets there. There are also kind of incipient links with various ministries interacting. There's capacity building going on. So I think it's very, it's kind of fairly broad. The motivations aren't necessarily state-driven. That's another difference. And I think it's interesting because you actually see the Chinese approach and how that's changed over the years. One thing you've seen, and people who know China better and China in Africa better than I do, point out how even China has been looking at, initially the Indian government was looking at what Chinese companies were doing in Africa. Now China has been looking at what India has been doing in Africa because it's considered, because it's not been as political, it was considered slightly more welcome by especially certain sections of the public. But India is also just to add, the sheer amount of investment that China has, there's no comparison at the moment. So in terms of a catch-up, and I'm not one for China-India races, but there's a huge gap.
Ambassador Kapur?
I'm going to discuss this issue from a different angle altogether. Firstly, if you see the acceptance of India as a partner country, in the countries where I've worked in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the acceptance is very, very high. It's very easy for Indian companies to establish themselves, to acquire local companies, to be welcomed. Now, if I, in my discussions with the leaders of many of these countries, they will tell me very clearly that we have the offers of Chinese aid, Chinese assistance, but we are not accepting it. We have been keeping it on hold for the last 5 years or more, and we would like India to come in and occupy this space. And will your country do that? Well, India is not an aggressive partner. It's not going into those assets. It's not going to grab those assets. It's not been doing that. So you have seen the play out in the global arena very clearly in front of your own eyes when you had the Olympics in China. Amongst all the countries through which the Olympic torch had to pass, there were protests against China in almost all of these countries. So just sitting down and contemplating that if we were to have the Olympics in India, in how many countries in the world would the people come out onto the streets to protest against India and Indian Olympics? It would be very difficult to get people out other than in China and maybe in Pakistan. But in Bangladesh, if you had to get people out, you would have to pay them at least 200-300 taka to get them out on the streets and give them lunch boxes for them to protest against India. So overall, India is not seen as an aggressive partner in any context. India has had relations with Africa for a very long time. So in the long term, this is going to only expand. The acceptance of India is going to increase because we are not people who seek out or aggressively grab assets, but we do have requirements. We do collaborate, and on the energy security, on the food security, there are a lot of efforts which are going on, joint collaborations. And India's net aid for the last few years to these African countries, to the other least developed countries, to the developing countries, has been much more than the net aid flowing into India.
Thank
So-
you. Thank you. Yeah, that's an important point. The lady just next to you. Yeah. Bina.
Bina Sarwar, I'm a journalist. Thank you all for fascinating presentations, for your fascinating presentations. There's something that I just, as a quick comment and then a question to all of you, probably to Mr. Riedel more than anybody else, is that you have these relationships, India and China, and the United States and China, and the United States and India, and in the past, all of them have had this history of hostility. I mean, we haven't forgotten that, right? And now you have this huge economic partnerships between all three of them. And my observation is just that I wish that we could have a similar kind of trade relationships between India and Pakistan, and we know what hinders that, so I'm not going to ask you to get into that. But my question is, what you said, Mr. Riedel, about the options in case there's another strike. There are, of course, lots of options ranging from fairly benign to very aggressive. But my question is, isn't that exactly what the attackers want? And what kind of response would be least likely to play into their hands? Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely right. That is the purpose of terrorist attacks like that. And that is why successive Indian leaders, Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, and others have refrained from moving forward. But there comes a point in politics where it becomes very hard to do that anymore. I'll put it to you this way. I cannot imagine an American president who would say, okay, big deal, we'll move on. Now, we've had successive Indian prime ministers who've chosen not to say it in those terms, but to in effect do it that way. And it becomes harder and harder. And I think it'll be very difficult, particularly for a prime minister elected with the persona and the political person that Narendra Modi has to be in that kind of position. We all want our leaders to demonstrate great wisdom and maturity in crisis moments like that. Don't count on it.
Yes, sir.
Will strategic partnership emerge between India and United States? My observation is a good example between Ayres and Dhume. Partnership has already emerged.
We would hope that the ambitions are greater than that.
And one last question. I will take it from the back of the room because I haven't you have had your hand up for quite a while. Please, go ahead.
I'm from the Embassy of Serbia, newcomer in Washington. My question might sound simple. Question is whether India, as a superpower sui generis within non-aligned movement, might have some opportunity with United States to improve some ongoing political process here or there.
Should I answer that, Ambassador Haqqani?
Sure, go ahead, Ambassador.
Well, if I see the strategic threats faced by the US today and by the global community in the future, between terrorism and what has been called by some analysts as expansionism of China in the South China Seas, in the Indian border, on the Tibet issue, so many threats which are there, the aspect of the pivot to Asia policy of the US, the partnership which can reasonably have some success of solution in the future is a very strong and a very soundly based partnership between US and India. India has the strength, India has the manpower, India has the military, India has a landmass, India is a neighbor to China, and India has the confidence in its own future to be able to stand up to China or any other threat in the world. In terrorism, we have performed exceedingly well in the sense we have the second largest population of Muslims in the world after Indonesia, and hardly any Muslim from India is a partner in global terrorism. So till US understands that this basic dynamic is going to be one of the deciding factors for the global, evolving global scenarios in terms of all the conflict, theaters of conflict everywhere, and that India is one country which can partner with the US, but on a very different basis, as an equal partner or as a dialogue partner, but not as a subset or as a what people have termed as client state. So till that shift takes place in the perceptions and in the interactions, this may not fructify, but this is the only way that will really lead to some sort of greater collaboration ultimately to tackle the problems on not just these fronts, on so many other fronts of democracy, of the threats which the nations are facing in the Middle East, in so many other arenas. So that is my hypothesis. I don't know how far it'll see the light of the day, but that is a hope. And this visit of Prime Minister Modi to that extent will be a game changer, because there is going to be greater realization of this aspect on both the sides. Thank you.
Final comments from Tanvi.
Just quickly, I mean, I think it's good to be optimistic. We're all talking about the partnership, but I think it's important to keep one thing in mind. I don't like to use the word non-alignment because I think it's a bit dated. I like to use the word diversification. And that is something that every Indian government, irrespective of party, has followed, which means having multiple partnerships. And so, yes, we will see a visit, but India will probably welcome President Putin, for example, in India in October. Mr. Modi, over the last few months, has made sure and tried to develop a whole range of partnerships. So I think we shouldn't be talking about kind of a move away from that in any significant way. One thing to keep in mind, for example, is even Prime Minister Vajpayee and many of his team, they might not have used the word non-alignment. They used the phrase strategic autonomy a lot. That hasn't gone away. I would also just say one thing. The India and US are within that context, though, having to grapple with the situation where the US is used to dealing with allies. It's used to dealing with adversaries. This kind of in-between country, this friends plus or partner plus, is something I think the US is going to have to learn. And I think there's already been progress. I think there's an understanding that India does not, and as India says, it's not a Japan or the UK. And I think there is understanding here of that. This is why you see repeatedly American officials saying we're not asking India to be an ally. On the Indian side, there has to be learning that, yes, while there's this diversification, the reality is that if you look at the relationship in terms of depth and breadth, there is a difference in terms of India's relationship with the US. This is not an hub and spoke partnership model. All those relationships are not equal.
Alyssa, do you want to have some last comments?
No.
No. Anybody else? Sadanand? Good. Okay, well, we just finished on time, even if we didn't start on time, which is an accomplishment. Thank you all very much for being such a good audience. And I would like to thank our panelists for making the time. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is actually not the first time I've been. But it is the first time I've ever sat between them on a panel.
Hi.
I know you make it to Avni. I'm going to give it to Avni.
Yeah, some of that is still coming, yeah. We don't have a full sense of how his policy will emerge.
Thank you for coming.
And I appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure.
And when are you going to come and give us a talk?
Okay.
When?
I'm crashing on my new book.
That is pre-season.
Okay.
And again, a terrific presentation.
It's been a bit challenging to do. The panel, I mean, the conferences that just was quite good. But yeah, Saturday I'm already doing media, not going to the, what is it called, the Global Citizens Festival.
Are you going to, what you're doing to MSG on Sunday?
MSG on Sunday, and then the dinner at night.